I used to know the date without looking at a calendar. The 6th of every month sat heavy in my body, the way an old injury warns you before the weather changes. Even when I tried to ignore it, my hands moved slower that morning, my thoughts dragging behind me as if they already knew where I was going. 6 years had passed since my husband Caleb died. Long enough for people to stop lowering their voices when they said his name. Long enough for sympathy to thin into something quieter and less patient, but not long enough for the responsibility he left behind to loosen its grip on my life. I woke before my alarm, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in its tired circle. Jordan was still asleep in the next room, sprawled sideways across his bed the way children do when they feel safe. I lay there listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside our apartment window, counting breaths until the familiar weight settled fully in my chest. I got up without waking him. Coffee first, then his lunch. Peanut butter sandwich, apple slices, a granola bar I'd bought in bulk because it was cheaper that way. I checked my wallet twice, even though I already knew the envelope was there, pressed flat and waiting. $300, cash, clean bills. I always made sure of that. It wasn't superstition, it was habit. The money had come out of my account 2 days earlier, transferred and withdrawn in careful steps so nothing bounced. I'd learned to plan around it, to treat it like rent or electricity, something fixed, something not up for discussion. By the time Jordan padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, I had already sealed the envelope and slipped it into the side pocket of my purse. "You working late today?" he asked, climbing onto his chair. "Not too late," I said. "You got practice after school." He nodded, already focused on his cereal. At 8 years old, he knew our routines as well as I did. I watched him eat, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the way his hair never quite lay flat no matter how often I brushed it. He looked like his father in ways that still caught me off guard. The same thoughtful crease between his brows when he concentrated. The same quiet intensity. I drove him to school and waited until he disappeared through the doors before pulling back into traffic. The sky over Cleveland was low and gray, the kind that pressed down without threatening rain. I headed east, toward the older part of the city where the buildings leaned a little, and the sidewalks told stories if you knew how to read them. The apartment complex where my in-laws lived had been standing since before I was born. Red brick darkened by decades of exhaust and weather. 5 floors, no elevator. The paint on the front door peeled in thin curls that caught on your sleeve if you brushed past too close. I parked where I always parked, in the narrow space near the side entrance, and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. Through the windshield, I could see the windows stacked above one another, most of them covered with mismatched blinds or curtains that never fully closed. I told myself the same thing I told myself every month. Just get it done. Inside, the stairwell smelled faintly of damp concrete and old cooking oil. My footsteps echoed as I climbed, each floor announcing itself with a small change in sound. On the second floor, someone's radio played gospel low enough that I could hear the rhythm, but not the words. On the third, the smell of fried onions drifted through a cracked door. Life went on in pieces all around me. By the time I reached the 5th floor, the air felt different, still, heavy. The hallway light flickered once before steadying, casting everything in a yellowed glow. Apartment 5B. I stopped in front of the door and adjusted my purse, pressing my fingers briefly against the envelope as if to reassure myself it was real. Then I knocked. 3 times. Firm but respectful. It took longer than usual for anyone to answer. I stood there listening to the quiet, aware of my own breathing, the faint buzz of the light above me. Finally, I heard movement. Slow steps, the scrape of a chair. The door opened just enough for Ruth Turner's face to appear. She didn't smile. "You're early," she said. "I got off work a little sooner," I replied. "I didn't want to be late." She opened the door another inch, the chain still latched, and held out her hand without a word. I passed the envelope through the narrow space. She took it, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest second, then tucked it into the pocket of her sweater without looking inside. "Leonard's resting," she said. "His leg's been acting up." "I hope he feels better," I said. "Jordan asked about you both this morning." Her mouth tightened. "Kids are loud." "He's older now," I said gently. "He understands how to behave." We'll see, she replied, already reaching for the door. I hesitated. I could bring him by this weekend, just for a little while. Ruth's eyes flicked past me, down the hallway, then back again. We'll let you know. The door closed with a soft but final click. I stood there a moment longer, staring at the chipped paint where the lock met the frame. There was no sound from inside, no television, no conversation. Just silence, thick and complete. I turned and walked back down the stairs, the envelope already gone, the familiar hollow settling in its place. Outside, the courtyard buzzed with late afternoon noise. A group of teenagers shot hoops at the far end, their laughter sharp and bright against the concrete. Two women sat on a bench, snapping beans into a plastic bowl, their conversation rising and falling in easy rhythm. I was almost to my car when someone called my name. Naomi! I turned. Mrs. Dolores Finch was sitting near the entrance, her cane resting across her knees. She'd lived in the building longer than anyone I knew, long enough to see generations move through and out again. People listened to her, whether they admitted it or not. Yes, ma'am, I said, walking over. She studied my face for a moment, then patted the bench beside her. Sit a second. I did. She leaned closer, lowering her voice, though there was no one nearby who seemed to be listening. You just came from upstairs, she said. Yes. She shook her head slowly. You still sending that money every month? I felt a familiar tightening in my stomach. It's almost done, I said. Just a few more. Mrs. Finch clicked her tongue. That's what you said last year. It's what I promised, I replied. She sighed and looked out toward the basketball court. You ever notice how quiet that apartment is during the day? They're older, I said automatically. They rest a lot. And you ever notice how it ain't so quiet after midnight? I didn't answer. She turned to me then, her eyes sharp despite her age. I've lived here a long time, Naomi. I know the difference between old people moving around and somebody else. A chill crept up my arms. What are you saying? I'm saying you should stop paying for a minute, she said, and you should pay attention. I shook my head. My husband is gone. There's nothing to pay attention to. She didn't argue. She just leaned back and picked up her cane. You do what you think is right. But if you ever decide you want to see what's really going on up there, check the camera by the stairwell. I drove away with her words repeating in my head, each turn of the phrase settling deeper than the last. That night, after Jordan was asleep and the apartment was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my notebook. 6 years, $300 a month. I ran my finger down the page, stopping at the total I'd written and rewritten so many times. I told myself I was doing the right thing. But for the first time, the numbers didn't bring comfort. They brought questions. That night, sleep came in pieces. I drifted off, then surfaced again, my mind replaying Mrs. Finch's voice in the gaps between dreams. You should pay attention. I turned onto my side and stared at the faint glow of the streetlight bleeding through the blinds, listening to the rhythm of Jordan's breathing from the next room. Each inhale and exhale steadied me, the way it always had. Whatever else felt uncertain, my son's presence was solid, real. I told myself I was tired. That was all. The next morning, life resumed its shape. I dressed for work, packed Jordan's bag, walked him to the bus stop. The envelope was already gone, the money transferred into someone else's pocket, and the familiar post-payment numbness settled over me like a thin blanket. I'd learned to move through that feeling efficiently, to keep my head down and my thoughts orderly. At the office, I processed claims and corrected billing codes, my fingers moving across the keyboard on instinct. Around me, coworkers talked about weekend plans and rising grocery prices. Someone complained about a cousin who never paid back borrowed money. I kept my eyes on my screen, but my mind snagged on the words, never paid back. During my lunch break, I opened my budgeting app without really meaning to. The numbers stared back at me, neat and unforgiving. Rent, utilities, school supplies, groceries. And there it was, marked in careful repetition. Turner obligation, $300. I closed the app and sat back, pressing my thumb into the edge of the table until the pressure grounded me. For 6 years, I had never missed a month. Not when my hours were cut, not when Jordan needed braces, Not when my car broke down and I took the bus for weeks. I had rearranged my life around that payment, treating it as something sacred, something untouchable, because questioning it felt like questioning Caleb himself. After work, I picked Jordan up from practice and listened as he talked about drills and missed shots. When he asked if we could visit his grandparents soon, I felt the question land in my chest before I answered. Soon, I said. We'll see. That evening, after dinner, I took the trash out. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed the security camera mounted near the stairwell, its small red light blinking steadily. I'd passed it countless times without a thought. Now I found myself slowing, studying its angle, the way it faced upward toward the higher floors. I stood there longer than necessary, pretending to check my phone. Pay attention. Back inside, I washed dishes and wiped down the counters, my movements methodical. I wasn't panicking. I wasn't afraid. But something had shifted, subtle as a hairline crack. The routine I'd relied on no longer felt as solid as it once had. Before bed, I pulled out the old folder where I kept documents related to Caleb's death. The certificate was there, creased at the corners from being handled too often in the early days. I traced the printed letters with my eyes, noting details I'd never lingered on before. Dates, signatures, official stamps. Everything looked the way it always had. I closed the folder and slid it back into the drawer. I wasn't ready to pull at threads yet. I didn't know where they led, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. But lying in the dark, listening to the building settle around me, I realized something I couldn't undo. For the first time since Caleb died, I wasn't just enduring. I was watching. And once you start watching, really watching, it becomes impossible to go back to not knowing. The thing about suspicion is that it doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself or demand attention. It slips in quietly, disguising itself as a practical thought, a harmless observation you could explain away if you tried hard enough. For the first few days after my conversation with Mrs. Finch, I tried very hard. I told myself she was bored, that she had lived in that building too long and started seeing patterns where none existed. I reminded myself that grief does strange things to people, especially when it's shared. 6 years was a long time, but not so long that the loss of a husband stopped echoing in unexpected ways. Still, I found myself noticing things I hadn't noticed before. The hallway on the 5th floor, for example. When I passed by on my way up or down, there was always the same stillness. Not the peaceful quiet of rest, but something flatter, as if the air itself had been held in place. Other apartments leaked sound, televisions, voices, the occasional argument or laugh. Apartment 5B did not. I told myself that meant Ruth and Leonard were private people. Careful, old-fashioned. At work, I caught myself staring out the window longer than usual, my reflection faint in the glass. I thought about the way Ruth never counted the money, the way she took it without comment, without gratitude or hesitation. $300 might not mean much to some people, but it meant something to me. It always had. I thought about how little they asked about Jordan. Not his grades, not his friends, not the things that lit him up when he talked. They treated him like a detail, something attached to me rather than a piece of Caleb. That night I dreamed of stairwells, endless ones. I was climbing, always climbing, my legs growing heavier with each step. When I woke, my calves ached as if I'd actually been moving all night. Jordan was already awake, humming softly to himself as he tied his shoes. I watched him from the doorway, a familiar swell of protectiveness rising in my chest. Whatever else was uncertain, my responsibility to him wasn't. After I dropped him off, I drove past my in-laws' building without stopping. I told myself it was nothing, just a different route. But as I passed, my eyes lifted instinctively to the 5th floor windows. The blinds were drawn, as always. Midweek, I ran into Mrs. Finch again. This time, it was in the laundry room. She sat on one of the folding chairs, her basket beside her, watching the machines churn. "You look tired," she said. "I didn't sleep well," I replied. She nodded slowly. "That's how it starts." I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't need to. We stood there in companionable silence, the dryers thumping rhythmically. "You ever hear footsteps at night?" she asked casually. "I sleep pretty heavy," I said. Mm-hmm, she replied, unconvinced. If you ever don't, listen around 1 or 2 in the morning. She stood then, lifting her basket with surprising ease. I won't say nothing else. Just don't ignore your instincts. I watched her leave, my chest tight. That night I did not sleep heavy. It was nearly 1:30 when I woke, my eyes snapping open for no clear reason. The apartment was dark, the air still. I lay there listening. At first there was nothing. Then faintly, a sound filtered through the walls. A door opening somewhere above. A measured step. Another. I held my breath. The footsteps were deliberate, not shuffling, not hurried either, just purposeful. They crossed overhead and faded, replaced by the distant hum of plumbing. A toilet flushed. Water ran. I lay there long after the sound stopped, my heart beating far too fast for the quiet room around me. The next morning I felt foolish. Exhaustion had a way of exaggerating things. Buildings made noise, pipes shifted, people woke at odd hours. But the sense of being watched, of patterns forming just out of reach, lingered. On Friday I stopped by the building again, this time earlier than usual. I parked and sat in my car, pretending to scroll through my phone while I observed the comings and goings. Residents passed in and out, carrying groceries, greeting one another. No one came or went from the 5th floor. Later, while taking out my trash that evening, I noticed the camera again. Its lens angled toward the upper stairs, steady and unblinking. That night, after Jordan was asleep, I stood in the hallway longer than necessary, staring at it. I wasn't ready to look. Not yet, but I knew I would be. Because once doubt takes root, it doesn't stay quiet for long. By the time I finally decided to act, the doubt had already settled too deeply to ignore. It wasn't panic that pushed me forward. It was something quieter, a steady pressure, like a finger pressing into the same spot over and over again until you can't pretend it doesn't hurt. I started with what felt safest, observation. I paid attention to patterns, days, times, habits. I noted when the 5th floor seemed most still and when it didn't. I listened more carefully when I passed through the stairwell, slowing my steps, pretending to check my phone while my ears stayed alert. The sounds were never dramatic. No arguments, no loud music, just movement, weight shifting, doors opening and closing softly, as if whoever was inside understood the value of not being heard. At work, my focus slipped. I reread the same emails, corrected the same line of numbers twice. Eventually, I did what I always did when I needed clarity. I went back to facts. During lunch, I pulled up my bank statements. 6 years of payments stared back at me in neat rows. Same amount, same timing, never late, never questioned. I calculated the total again, even though I already knew it. $21,600. I swallowed hard and closed the app. That evening, after Jordan went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table and pulled out the folder again. This time I laid everything out. The death certificate, insurance correspondence, letters from Ruth about the debt, written in careful formal language that never once acknowledged how much I'd already paid. I noticed something then that I hadn't before. There was no documentation of the original loan, no contract, no bank record, just Ruth's word, repeated often enough that it had become truth. I thought of calling her, asking questions, but I knew how that would go. She would sigh, remind me of Caleb's sacrifice, tell me not to dig where I didn't belong. So instead, I called Andre. Andre was my cousin on my mother's side, a man who made his living making sense of systems that were designed to confuse people. Insurance compliance, regulatory audits, quiet investigations that rarely made headlines, but unraveled lives all the same. "What's wrong?" he asked when I told him I needed to see him. "I don't know yet," I said, "but something isn't adding up." We met the next afternoon at a coffee shop halfway between our jobs. I didn't explain everything. I didn't have to. I just slid the folder across the table and watched his expression change as he flipped through it. "This is thin," he said finally. "That's what I thought." "You've been paying based on this?" He tapped one of Ruth's letters. "For 6 years." Andre leaned back, studying me. "You want me to look?" I nodded. "I can't pull bank record," he said, "but I can look at patterns, benefits, public filings. That's enough." He didn't smile. "If something's wrong, You might not like what you find. I already don't, I said. While Andre worked quietly, I kept watching. Late one night, close to 2 in the morning, I woke again. This time I didn't move. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The footsteps came, unmistakable now. Heavier than Ruth's, more controlled than Leonard's slow shuffle. They crossed overhead, paused, then continued. I pictured the stairwell, the camera, its unblinking lens. The next day, on my way home from work, I stopped in the hallway and stared at it again. I wasn't afraid. I was calculating. If someone was coming and going regularly, the footage would show it. Not clearly, maybe, but enough. 2 days later, Andre called. They haven't touched their benefits, he said without preamble. Not in years. What do you mean? I mean their pensions and Social Security are stacking. No withdrawals, no hardship filings, nothing. I closed my eyes. Then how are they living? Cash, he replied. Someone's giving them cash. The room felt suddenly smaller. There's more, he added. Your husband's insurance payout was minimal, almost symbolic. That's what they told me. And yet their accounts say they're comfortable, better than comfortable. I thanked him and hung up, my hands shaking despite myself. That night I stood in the stairwell longer than ever before. When I finally walked away, I knew what came next. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was about to look. The first time I watched the footage, I didn't feel anything at all. Andre had warned me not to expect clarity. Old cameras, limited angles, grainy resolution. Enough to suggest movement, not enough to tell a story on their own. He transferred the files to a small flash drive and slid it across the table as if it weighed more than it did. Watch it more than once, he said. Details hide in repetition. That night, after Jordan fell asleep, I locked my bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed with my laptop balanced on my knees. I plugged the drive in, opened the folder, and stared at the timestamps listed in neat rows. I picked one at random. The screen flickered, then steadied. The camera showed the stairwell between the 4th and 5th floors. Empty at first. Still. The clock in the corner ticked forward in silent seconds. Then a shape appeared at the bottom of the frame. A man climbed the stairs slowly, one hand brushing the railing, his head angled slightly downward. He wore a baseball cap pulled low, the brim hiding his face. His jacket was dark, loose, familiar in a way I couldn't yet place. I leaned closer, my breath shallow. He reached the landing, paused, then continued upward. When he put weight on his right foot, his left followed a half-beat later. Not a limp exactly, more like a habit, a way of moving that belonged to a body that knew its own limits. I froze the frame. My pulse thudded in my ears. I told myself it was coincidence, that people walk the way their bodies taught them to walk. That memory was unreliable, especially memories shaped by grief. I watched the clip again, and again. By the 4th time, my hands were shaking. Caleb had always led with his right foot. Always. Even after the accident. Especially after the accident. He used to joke that his left side never quite trusted itself again. I shut the laptop and sat there in the dark, my thoughts refusing to line up. The next clip was dated the following month. Same time, same angle, same movement. By the 3rd, the pattern was undeniable. The man didn't knock. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a set of keys, and unlocked the door to apartment 5B without hesitation. I closed my eyes, pressing my palm flat against my chest, as if I could slow my heart by force. Caleb was dead. I had buried him. I had stood at the graveside with Jordan clutched against my leg and promised a future I believed in. The footage kept playing. I didn't confront anyone. Not Ruth, not Leonard, not even Andre. I needed more than recognition, more than instinct. I needed something that couldn't be explained away. Over the next week, I watched the footage at different times of day, matching it against my own memories. The man always appeared within 24 hours of my payment, sometimes the same night, sometimes the next, always after. I remembered Ruth's urgency, her insistence on cash, her refusal to let me come inside. The pieces aligned with a quiet precision that left no room for comfort. One afternoon, I returned to the building earlier than usual and sat in my car, watching. Around dusk, Leonard emerged carrying a large black trash bag. He moved carefully, glancing around before tossing it into the dumpster. I waited a few minutes, then got out and approached after he'd gone back inside. Inside the bag, beneath the smell of old food and damp paper, were pizza boxes, beer cans, the kind with pull tabs, Caleb's favorites. That night, I didn't cry. I felt something colder settle in its place. The next morning, Andre called again. "There's something else," he said. "I dug a little deeper into your husband's work history." My fingers tightened around the phone. "And he didn't die on a job site," Andre said carefully. "There was an investigation, financial irregularities, missing funds." I leaned back against the kitchen counter, staring at the wall. "So the death was convenient," Andre finished. I thanked him and hung up, my mind already moving ahead. That evening, I visited Ruth again. I knocked, envelope in hand, my face carefully arranged into something neutral. She opened the door the same way she always did, chain-latched, eyes sharp. "I brought something extra," I said, lifting the bag I carried. "For Leonard, a foot massager." "I heard it helps." Her expression shifted, just slightly. "That won't be necessary." "I insist," I said. "After everything." She hesitated too long. From somewhere deeper in the apartment, a man coughed. Low, familiar. Ruth's face tightened. "You should go," she said quickly. I nodded and stepped back. As the door closed, certainty settled over me. The lie wasn't just alive, it was being fed. Once the truth settled, it did not roar. It did not demand immediate action or dramatic release. It sat with me, steady and unmoving, like a weight I had finally learned how to carry without buckling. I understood then why panic hadn't taken me. Panic belongs to people who are surprised. I was no longer surprised. I was awake. I moved carefully, deliberately. Nothing outwardly changed. I still woke early, still packed Jordan's lunches, still went to work and returned home on schedule. I still answered Ruth's calls with the same measured tone and brought the envelope each month as promised, $300 counted and sealed. She never noticed the difference, because she never looked for one. People who believe they are in control rarely do. I told Andre only what he needed to know, enough to confirm, not enough to alert. He warned me once more, gently this time. "Once you pull this thread, there's no tying it back." "I'm not trying to," I said. We spoke in short conversations after that, quiet ones. He pointed me toward records I could request myself, housing logs, municipal death filings, old employment reports that hadn't been sealed properly. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, they formed a picture that was hard to ignore. Caleb had not died the way I was told. The urgency of the cremation, the absence of a body, the speed with which the paperwork had been processed, all of it had worked in his favor, and in mine, at least at the time. I had been too busy surviving to question the convenience of it all. Now I questioned everything. I took a day off work and drove to the county office downtown. I sat in plastic chairs and waited my turn. I filled out forms with steady handwriting, asking for copies of records most people never thought to revisit. Each stamp, each signature, each sealed envelope felt like a small step forward. At home, after Jordan went to bed, I laid everything out on the dining table. Not in piles, but in order. Dates, times, discrepancies, gaps. There was no room left for doubt. Caleb had been alive the entire time, and he had chosen, every day for 6 years, to let me believe otherwise. I thought of the nights I'd cried quietly so Jordan wouldn't hear, the birthdays he'd missed, the questions I'd answered with half-truth meant to protect a child who deserved better. I didn't rage. I didn't break anything. I closed the folder, slid it into my bag, and turned off the light. The next move would not be emotional, it would be final. The last payment came on a Thursday. I knocked on the door of apartment 5B with the same 3 firm wraps I'd used for years. Ruth answered, chain in place, her eyes flicking briefly to the hallway behind me before settling back on my face. "You're on time," she said. "I always am." She took the envelope, heavier this time, though she didn't know why. Inside was the usual cash, plus something else folded carefully between the bills. Something she wouldn't notice until later. "I won't be back next month," I said. Her hand paused. "Why not?" "It's finished," I replied. "The obligation." She studied me, searching for something in my expression. I gave her nothing. That night, just after midnight, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone in front of me, the folder open beside it. At 1:47, the notification came in. The stairwell camera captured motion. I didn't watch it. I didn't need to. I waited. At 2:03, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Caleb stood there. He looked older, thinner. The confidence he once wore so easily sat awkwardly on him now, like a borrowed coat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "You shouldn't be here," I said calmly. He swallowed. "Naomi." I held up my hand. "Don't." Behind him, red and blue lights flickered faintly against the walls. Footsteps echoed. Voices. Ruth screamed from somewhere down the hall. Caleb turned, panic finally breaking through his composure. "What did you do?" "I stopped pretending," I said. The officers moved past me, their presence efficient and unremarkable. There were no raised voices, no dramatic accusations, just questions answered with documents I had prepared and handed over without shaking. As they led Caleb away, he looked back once. Not in anger, in disbelief. I closed the door. The next morning, Jordan asked why the hallway was so noisy the night before. I told him the truth, in a way a child could understand. "Some people lied," I said, "and they have to fix that now." "Are we okay?" he asked. I kissed the top of his head. "We are." The building felt lighter in the weeks that followed. Ruth and Leonard moved out quietly. No one stopped me to ask questions. Mrs. Finch nodded at me once in passing, her expression knowing. 6 years had taken a lot from me, but as I watched Jordan run ahead of me down the sidewalk one afternoon, laughing without looking back, I understood something I hadn't before. The man I buried was never really gone, but the woman he tried to drain was, and she wasn't coming back. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. There were no crowds gathered in the hallway, no whispered conversations that stopped when I passed. Life in the building returned to its ordinary rhythm with surprising speed, as if the disturbance had been absorbed and smoothed over by habit. That was how I knew it was truly over. Jordan and I settled into a quieter routine. Mornings felt lighter, even though nothing about them had changed on the surface. I still woke early, still packed lunches, still counted bills. But the space in my chest where dread used to sit remained empty, and I did not rush to fill it. One afternoon as we walked home from the bus stop, Jordan reached for my hand the way he had when he was younger. His grip was firm, trusting. "Are Grandma and Grandpa coming back?" he asked, not looking at me. "No," I said gently. "They won't be." He thought about that for a moment. Okay. That was all he needed. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. Official, neutral in tone. It explained next steps, timelines, restitution procedures. I read it once, then placed it in the folder with the rest of the documents. I did not reread it. I did not savor it. Justice, when it finally arrives, is rarely loud. It is administrative. It is procedural. And it is enough. I ran into Mrs. Finch again near the courtyard. She looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Told you to pay attention," she said. "I did," I replied. She smiled faintly, satisfied, and shuffled on. On a Sunday morning not long after, I opened the drawer where I used to keep the envelope money. The space inside was bare. I closed the drawer without ceremony. 6 years of obligation had taught me how to endure. Letting go taught me something else entirely. That survival does not have to be permanent. That strength does not have to mean silence. That what is taken can, sometimes, be reclaimed. Not through anger, but through clarity. That evening, as Jordan slept and the apartment settled into its familiar quiet, I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. The world outside continued, indifferent to what I had lost and what I had recovered. I did not feel triumphant. I felt finished. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough.